Here, our webinar is on the essential steps for disaster recovery. There's a couple of key things we put in here, and we built this presentation with the goal of diving right in so we can get right to the meat of the content we promised. We've got plenty of examples of data after we cover some of the early listenness that we promised, the things that were built off of our experience and past history working on disaster recovery, as well as business continuity. And so with that said, I'm going to dive right in. Presentation today will be done by myself, Joe Cox. I've got many years of experience, and here at OFFSITE I serve as the Vice President of Managed Services. I also manage our consulting. I have 18 years managing facilities and teams behind me, as well as several different types of certifications and training. I've also served to manage a lot of information technology teams, and have been required in the past to, and for multiple companies, provide assessments of their disaster recovery, as well as provide the design of DR plans, participate in business continuity planning, and take on lead roles in that as well. And when I speak about in this presentation, a lot of the strategies behind what I think are the fastest, most effective methods for companies to address IT disaster recovery as well as business continuity. These things are all designed coming from experience. Today I've got Brandon McCoy joining me from Veeam. Brandon is a cloud sales engineer with Veeam Software. And Brandon, if you want to say hi and give a little quick background.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. So Brandon McCoy, system engineer here at Veeam. I'm located in Atlanta, Georgia, and been with the company for a little over 2 years, focusing solely on our managed service business.
All right, thank you, Brandon. With that, I'm going to dive right into one of the quick things that we did promise to deliver in this, which was a quick summary list of the top reasons we believe DR plans fail. One of the things you'll notice in this list is that there are no references to technology or technology misconfiguration, because what we found is, jumping right in, one of the first items that we see that can derail efforts to have proper disaster recovery in place is having a company's senior management team view disaster recovery and the resource needs when they come through as information technology team requests. This can be very damaging to the efforts because disaster recovery isn't about technology. Our technologies simplify and improve our ability to recover to an operational state, but that's why we end up having these things get managed long-term, or at least configured by technology teams, but the actual need obviously is a core business need. We look at also disaster recovery success is often poorly understood and tracked. And there are a couple of things that I've observed in the field with both small and large organizations, and that is in some companies, disaster recovery can be looked at as data center recovery in terms of the value of the hardware and real estate, and we looked at it as something that can be largely addressed as an insurance policy of sorts. Also, as we look at tracking over time, many companies look at that compliance outward step in paperwork when they get the check boxes signed off that backups are being done or pushed off site. They often believe that's enough, and there's a satisfaction level there that because the compliance piece was passed, that disaster recovery can stop at that point. And also assumptions, because the IT team has some resources and the expertise to recover, that they have the ability to meet a company's requirements. And that also leads to a lot of problems because there's a difference between most companies' production performance capabilities in the production data centers and the capabilities in their recovery centers. Also, long-term, when we looked at this, between those that we felt were the most successful versus those that were doing the work and felt good about their plans, it was often a proper risk analysis had not been completed or clearly communicated through the management teams in their companies. Because again, keeping your business running, keeping it operational, and being able to survive those disasters without it being something that knocks 20, 30, 40% of the company's value out because the primary data centers took a complete hit. In order to do that, there's a need to be able to have done that business impact analysis to really understand the value of your data. With that said, I put some quick one question polling questions out. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. These are all anonymous, and what these are designed to do is, if you don't mind quick voting in these and just giving me a yes or no answer, I'm going to quickly turn around and share these while we do the presentation. This first one I put together because when you look at data being operational, it's really, how do you feel about knowing what your data is worth while that data is available to all your employees from the applications you want it in place and being used with? And once you get that all in place, do you really have a good feel? And if we look at, I wish I had remembered the numbers for this, but the Ford Motor Company had just come out and talked about one of the key values they've discovered they have is they're tracking, I think it was hundreds of thousands of automobiles now on the road, and discovering what a real value that data is and how the data in and of itself is suddenly a major part of Ford Motor Company's value. I'm going to end polling and share the results really quickly. So I think this kind of showed what I had a feeling of, in that 73% of those that voted on this didn't feel their company had a solid feel for the estimate of keeping that data operational. Okay, I'm going to move on now and hit on that next piece that we wanted to talk about how we saw the biggest challenges. Now, the primary goal of this for most IT teams really needs to be looked at as gaining leadership agreement and required resources. But that should really be the goal of everyone involved. And these efforts do not need to be led by IT teams, but they do need participation from those teams. But once you've gained agreement that the data is valuable, the next piece of this comes in, and that the blueprint for success is to first understand the scope of what all clients, partners, vendors, employees, and governmental organizations require of your company. And also to be able to understand the value of those requirements, because that's going to decide what your risk exposure is, and that will help feed and decide what you should spend. We also recommend that all requirements be mapped clearly. Now, these first two aren't complex. They might sound like a lot of work, but they're really not. And how that should be mapped is there should be a clear connection, whether it's visual or in tables or in lists, that map the requirements people have, who has those requirements, and mapped through in one way or another through the applications that are used to do the process work that has value, and then also what those applications do. So we don't just build applications, as many of you, if you have IT experience or you work with those teams in any way, know a lot of data that goes into one system goes into multiple other systems, some of which aren't even in your companies or your data centers. So it's important to know what those connections are, and you have people in your companies that know that. So that's where, when I get to the next slide, you'll see where you can go step by step to make sure you understand not only the requirements of the people from step one, but you also work with that IT department to understand the current or near future required complexities of your production environment. Because we've been in a lot of production environments that have had very complex core routers and switches put in place that were not in their recovery data centers. They've also had very complex upgrades of a particular performance of equipment in terms of the SAN side, SAN switching. It could be any one of a million things that are in place. Those complexities need to be understood, because it's not enough just to have backups in place or storage and a few servers or enough servers you believe to run, because those servers reflect the configurations that you put on your routers and switches. So it's really important that those be understood and also tested. When those things get done, that's when it's really time to build, sell, and deploy an effective, flexible plan. The flexibility part comes in because so many requests come in of the production IT teams that they're regularly making changes. So it's really important that everyone involved in these efforts look at this as an ongoing thing and a part of that live performance data center environment at your core. You need to include those recovery resources as if they're just as important to your change management. I threw a quick polling question up there. Let me jump to the next one here. If I can pop that over or see if I do this right. Looks like I didn't get to the next question. Yeah, hold on, I'm gonna end that and see if I can, there we go, question 2. I'll launch the polling. There we go. I just had a quick question on, within the past 4 years, has your company completed a detailed business impact analysis to determine the impact of losing your primary data center? Now, business impact analysis I'm going to talk about next, but I think those of you that have done these in detail to really understand those things I talked about on the last slide, if you feel like you have a great grip on those, it's probably because you did that kind of work. And we got a quick group of votes in. We'll let it run for another 15 seconds here. But we promised to deliver our 4 key recommendations for plan success. You'll see as we go through these, there's a lot of little bits and pieces of this 4 items here that really become important as you get going. I'm going to end that polling and we'll share the results. As you can see, many of you have been in that position where you've either got what you feel are irrelevant business impact analysis, or that they've not really been done beyond the IT team, which really leaves information technology teams guessing. And many of you just haven't done one. These efforts are not things that really are looked at as things that make money for companies, so they often get overlooked. But everyone that works in the company, obviously, jobs are reliant upon having these things be operational. So I'm going to continue with this now. The next piece of this, when we talk about creating that business impact analysis, needs to start with employee interviews. So one of the things I put together was a series of processes that quickly get through business impact analysis. The first one really comes in putting together a list and tracking everybody key that needs to be interviewed by your lead on this project, knowing their key area of functionality and organization. Those interview questions can be rather simple. These should be interviews that are scheduled to last maybe 15 minutes, maybe 10. You want to get right to the point of what applications are used, how that employee describes the key processes that they feel are critical to keep operational if you lose a primary data center. And in this case, we're assuming on your disaster recovery, we're looking at a primary data center fail, whether that's tornado, fire, employee error, whatever it might be. The key questions are all revolving around what applications they use, how they use them. If they fail, what are the costs to the organization? I like to throw in a question on asking if there's a known penalty or a known financial loss, because many departments actually do their own work on those things, and they don't always get shared out to the whole company. You may have contracts signed with particular vendors or clients, so you may have specific penalties if things are unavailable. So then we take that data, and one of the real goals is to get the table together. And the table, as I refer to it, identifies the information technology you collected from your interview. This could be things like domain name services, Active Directory, everything we log into. They could be VMware infrastructure. They could be your wide area network connections, your firewalls, programs like Microsoft Exchange for email. Whatever those things are you use need to be mapped then to the critical functions. Once you map that critical function, and even though there are many, you want to focus in on those that need quick recovery, that have the highest penalties, so you make sure that gets conveyed when people view this information or it's presented. And then you want to put in the operational business unit or units that rely on that. You want to list the new recovery time objective that the employees involved or you feel are critical. Then you want to list the current recovery time, that's the honest recovery capability of the IT teams with the resources they have today. And then you want to do some simple math. We're taking the recovery time requested, subtracting the recovery capability today, and then we're getting our gaps. So anywhere we find gaps, we know we've got potential issues. And that's where we focus our risk moving forward when we analyze this. Oops, there we go. My experience has told me what comes next when those tables are done. They get thrown in a good report with some nice descriptions. What really brings more meaning to this you'll see in the next steps, but also these things need to describe how risk is determined. So who's ever leading this report and writing these things needs to look at how risk for your company is determined, estimate the cost impact, talk about the gaps in detail, perhaps even getting into potential, at this time, the cost to eliminate the gaps, maybe doing some comparisons of the cost to eliminate the gaps versus the risk you've calculated. So you start to put some math behind this and really view this from the perspective of a business owner, because when this information gets presented, ultimately it needs to sit in front of people that make those decisions and look at the company on behalf of the shareholders. This is the most unfun part for IT teams typically. You need to put on an accounting hat. The reason the math is important, I think we all know, but often this doesn't always fall on the IT team's shoulders. But if you can use some of the math that many finance teams would use and look at breaking out your equations, getting into asset values, exposure factors, single loss expectancy. I'm going to show you a quick table that makes this, I hope, easy. And I'm also putting together a quick spreadsheet for those that write our team afterwards. We'll get an email out to you later this week on a quick way to calculate these things, because the math provides illustration of your evidence development when people can see the equations, how you estimated what your values are, and you start to breathe some real life into the real risk that people have when they face this. So when we look at a quantitative risk analysis, I grabbed this from one of my CISSP study guides. It's the straight up way to do a real simple way to evaluate security or disaster recovery risk. I'm going to jump right to the table because these items are in there. What we want to look at first is we want to get to the results of the single loss expectancy. That's really saying in this example, if my primary data center takes a hit, what is it going to cost our organization? So to do that, we need to know the asset value. I think of all this information I'm throwing at you, the key piece here on the asset value is to understand these considerations on the right. It's not just about hardware, software, data, and the building. Often you need to work with your finance teams to really start to talk about the value of what your company gets out of using the data the way it does today, and the way your employees and clients rely upon it being in place. Because there are no companies I've walked into in the last 10 years that staff their companies planning for having their data not available and their systems not available, which really means when those things aren't available, you lose all the efficiencies your companies have gained over the last several decades. Many of you, it's built up for, I'm sure, 50 plus years of switching and adding computer system after computer system. So whatever you have in that data center needs to be measured up against your current plan. So after we come up with where our gaps are, in order to correct some of those gaps we believe we need to look at, in this case, I'm putting a $50 million figure on this particular data center with its value. And right now, if you're saying my exposure factor or the percent of that value that'll be lost if I have to recover using today's plan is 40%, well, then I'm looking at a single loss expectancy from losing a data center of 20 million in this case. Now, the next thing we want to hit, next item we want to hit is that annualized loss expectancy. And to do that, we take our single loss expectancy and then we multiply that by our annualized rate of occurrence. So this is the part where we get that annualized cost to our organization, because what we're doing is, if we're looking at fire, flood, and human factors in this case, we need to assign percentages. And the simplest way to think of the annualized rate occurrences, and I think floods are the most, are really the simplest. If we look at a data center located in a spot that's maybe considered on a 100-year floodplain, for example, or that's the historical occurrence, and you believe that's going to hit your data center if you have the kind of flood that could happen there, well, in that case, it would be a 1% chance. It's 1 every 100 years. You may be able to find these numbers online to be able to dig and really see what the risk should be calculated at based on the type of building you're in, the type of steps you've taken. Do you have things like waterless fire suppression systems? These numbers then, when you bring into account things like human factors, if you've got a number that you come up with in this example of a 5.25%, well, that annualized rate of occurrence just gets multiplied by the single loss expectancy. So in this example, we'd be looking at estimating 1,050,000 per year. Now, the reason we do this is because when we look at what would be your next step of how do I fix those or eliminate those gaps and risks? Then you want to compare up your solutions for the investments you would make and what those annual costs would be, because from a risk analysis perspective, spending those dollars, they need to be less than the risk you're taking on. I hope that's pretty straightforward, but I'm gonna continue on. Any questions after this, be happy to follow up on those as well. The second type of illustration that I recommend everybody hit, because these tend to have as much, and in some cases more impact, or to complete the data visualizations. So with these, I recommend people be creative, accurate, and use the names of the application system and processes that are most used within your organization. So when this data gets shared out, you have some quick receptivity of the people looking at the information. Because when you really effectively visually communicate this team to management teams, executives, board members, this is what you'll use to gain agreement and drive change. Now, the supporting evidence and information is going to be important, but this is the piece that can take you and give you the pictures that people can follow and really come up with that image in their mind of where your issues are. Now, I threw a quick example here. I just threw one of our data recovery diagrams in, but for the purpose of disaster recovery presentations and projects and a BIA, this is the wrong way to look at it. Often teams go in and they put in place a diagram of what they have today, but where that makes a mistake is it doesn't draw attention to what's needed. And often when you're presenting to management teams that don't work in information technology, this, and in this case, it's a great recovery plan, but you're not really highlighting where your issues are. So to simply talk through it and show what's in place today, often the missing items get lost, because anyone on the business side can see there's all sorts of references to backup repositories, backup tools, the types of diagrams, and this is a diagram that I put together as a fake sample manufacturer who's got parts production, all sorts of normal operations you'd have if you were a manufacturer, with sites in Australia, Germany, and the United States. So in this example, what we're showing is we're showing items in green that are fully deployed. Let me pull up a pointer here so you can follow along. In this objects key, those are fully deployed. The yellow have limited deployment, and the gray are identified needs. So if we look at this now, we can share a story and a visualization by showing people, here's the key processes we have. Everybody that manages in our company knows are in place. Those are relying on essential compute for our essential apps. There's also compute for other applications. Those are important, but we're not considered essential. These items heavily rely upon your core networks, your connections, your backup storage, and in this case, we've got tape and disk. This UPS, generators, dry fire suppressions, these are the things we all take and consolidate into one room. We keep them highly secure, we keep them great power, cooling, all the things we do for these. One of the actual things we create as exposure often is we often have things like backup in the same data center for high-speed recovery where we have our servers and our primary storage. We also often put our pairs of firewalls right next to each other in the same data center, which means our circuits terminate in that room. So the kind of exposure we create is a higher probability that a disaster event is going to take out both circuits, both firewalls, all sets of our recovery, except what gets pushed off-site. So if you're in a situation in a company where you have, third-party tape storage in a disaster where a data center like this is hit, if your locations look more like these for recovery capability, where you have a couple servers for essential compute, you're obviously going to have something to work off of. Other situations where you have some networking to rooms that you think you could use, you're going to have a very long recovery window. And in this sample manufacturer, they have what many companies have, a 1 or 2 day process that they can survive with. Might be 3 or 4 days, where you have paper processes and other items on workstations that you can get by with. But if you don't present the information in a way that shows all your gaps, but only shows what you have in place, you'll often lose your audience in terms of their ability to be focused on what needs to happen next. This is just another way to look at that, and I showed a little glimpse of this before. But if we look at, I'll zoom in here, tracking processes by putting in the area of the company with its processing, the different types of processing. In this example, a shipment order I'm pointing to. You've got different ways to ship and process orders based on shipment, carrier, truck. You can be looking at sales and selling teams and the systems they use, where the data goes, where it flows to next. You end up with these process lines of systems that can often be just as complicated as the processes your employees work. So getting those all in place, in this particular example, we created a little bit different view of process and software with the idea that we wanted to show what was happening for companies that were more process intensive, and also give them the ability to see everything in green we label. Those are things that are ready to recover. Red, not ready. Red with a blue glow. I kind of like these views of the data because what it does is it also shows items that would limit other applications from being able to be recovered quickly. And that's one of the things that a lot of companies, when they do a BIA, when that business impact analysis is going on, that's one of the things that comes out. You can't have underlying or relied upon technologies not available, but just because obviously your servers and systems are running in another location, if your employees can't get to them or get to them with the effective speed they need, you're going to run into problems anyway. The fourth item I put was really, I think a lot of companies need to consider adding a third party to these projects. If you have a business analyst that can break out the time to do these, that can work as well if they're not too tied to one area. But successful assessment projects like this often shift a company's perspectives. They arise changing requirements, and sometimes that arises a lot of internal conflict because you're really going to have someone that needs to do a deep dive with all your departments and bring out all the things that employees require that perhaps aren't being delivered, and what your clients need that may not be delivered in the case of a disaster. So those are really the four key items that I've seen work to help solidify, find the gaps, and also drive companies to want to get the resources where the gaps are and realize where their real issues are should they have the kind of disaster that they hope they don't. One more item I mentioned I would cover for this presentation too, I think is important, was looking at the high costs of having replication. If you need to replicate a whole production environment and you need it to operate at the kind of performance levels many companies do, we often recommend, in terms of hardware and software, trying to get tools that are vendor agnostic. It's one of the reasons we love Veeam, and Veeam's a partner on this and a sponsor of this presentation, but it's not because they're a sponsor. They're a sponsor because, and a partner, because they make great vendor agnostic software. When we look at their tools, some of the SANs we use, and a lot of the servers we've invested in here, we like that approach because it delivers some key benefits to us. It gives us the ability to replicate to less expensive SANs and servers at target backup locations. Now, those aren't lesser equipment pieces, but what happens over time, we don't have all of our equipment, and many companies don't. We don't have all of our production items and our replication site items aging at the same pace or growing at the same pace, depending upon the need. So one of the things this allows us to do is get the performance in place at both sites based upon what's the best business value for us at the time. And if we had invested in for example, SAN-based replication tools that were tied to one vendor's equipment, well, then we're going to be on that gear for forever, because buying additional items at multiple locations and constantly keeping them in place means you're tied to one vendor now for your software process and your hardware. And as we've all seen in technology, there's constant rising benefits coming from new providers. So keeping flexible is really important from the cost perspective. And then that ability to function with a wide variety of platforms lets us pull from standalone servers, VMware servers, lets us pull from Microsoft Hyper-V, whatever that piece is. When you start to work with vendors that are committed to being vendor agnostic, the big benefit comes in, and over time, they just keep adding platforms that they can address. And this also gives our teams familiar interfaces. And with customers I've worked with, we push these things all the time as really the top choice, because over time, you can work with easy to use familiar tools, and as the technology behind the scenes passes in and out, it gives us the ability to still work with that same interface. And making sure your recovery items are easy to use in terms of the tools, but also successful. The processes the team knows and reduce that human error really has been important to me here and other places I've been in the past where I've used Veeam and similar tools, because it just keeps that that backup set of tools, which you don't go to often, similar, easy to function. I'll move on from there, but I did have two quick final polling questions I wanted to throw at you. So let's see if I do this right this time. Yeah, last two questions. I'm going to give you just a minute or two. We've got two. The second one's a bit wordy. So if you could take a minute and jump through these two. The first one, with every application or server deployed within your organization, do you tend to include additional dollars of recovery costs as a required portion of the project estimated? So if, for example, a marketing department comes up and requests and says, I want a new server, I got approval for this software package, and I need you to spin up 2 VMs, by default, are you hitting them with that and saying, this is the cost, this is the option? Second question. While you sleep this particular evening, if a disaster strikes your data center, leaving that building as inaccessible for whatever the reason, so no one could get in and touch the technology and it's not running, recovering your applications and data will be, and then you can define how easy it will be for you to bring up a second site and what level. And I'll give that one another 15 seconds or so to get through it. I know we've got many of you out there that aren't voting. If you'd like to get one in, I'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds. And then I will share the results. Before we dive into questions too, if you have any on the data that was covered, we'll jump into that question period, but I'll also mention a few things about OFFSITE for those of you that aren't familiar. We get a very large effective data center footprint here in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We also have a secondary location in Denver, Colorado, and another in Chicago, Illinois. A significant part of our company is focused on building out custom suites for companies that need a data center and employee space side by side so that they can have IT teams work in close proximity or simply have those recovery resources ready. And we also have a very large, high density, very secure data center facility that also allows clients to put their own equipment in, and enterprise cloud offerings that include very quick replication recovery tools and systems waiting in Denver, Colorado, in case they're needed. Okay, it looks like we got a lot more votes in, so I'm going to end the polling and share the results. So it looks like the majority of people here don't include recovery costs as a default. And I wanted to ask that question because I've worked in environments where they did not include them, and we went through the efforts of getting them included as a default. It's not always an easy step, but the thing that I found many years ago in managing IT groups was that getting the dollars later was very difficult, but at the time people desired to put the app in place if they had to think about the cost. That felt like the right time. The other reason I found was when applications first go in, they don't get looked at as critical, but over time employees change how they use them, and before you know it, obviously then they become mission critical, and the dollars were never set aside for recovery. And it looks like right now, it looks like the majority of you feel like recovery would be easy enough. but recovering all applications perhaps not within the requested recovery time objectives. So it's where I think a lot of people sit. We still have a good sized portion that believes it would be very difficult or extremely difficult, but fortunately we don't have any that say close to impossible. That's good to see. I want to appreciate everyone who jumped in and voted on those for sharing. So let me pop ahead. This is just some sample diagrams that show some of the items at Offsite's high density room. I think from a perspective of the discussion we have here today, one of the key pieces I think is nice to show this also is when you look at things like clean agent fire suppression, grounded flooring, these things, those are all things to consider for yourselves as well, and how you manage that, and cabling, and everything else that goes into building a quality data center. Because when we look at that exposure value when you're doing your equations, definitely the better position you put your company in your primary data center reduces the risk and reduces that annualized projected loss from not having data center pieces in place. So I'm going to just pull up one thing real quick. And did anyone have any questions they wanted to throw out? You have really a couple of options. You could do that now if you'd like, or if you'd like, you can send questions to sales@offsite. The sales team will grab me. I'd be happy to cover any issues, questions, share any information, as well as the other thing we can do is if you'd like to schedule some quick short consultation time to kind of talk through the projects you're working on, ways we might be able to help, or at least could lend some words of advice along the way, we'd be happy to do that. With that said, I am going to turn this over to Brandon and have him get started on his presentation. Let me get the controls over to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, believe I have it now. Yep, okay, great. So yeah, we'll just start right here with a little humble brag. For those of you who maybe haven't heard of Veeam or don't know how awesome we are, lots of customers. If we look from left to right, you can see we have a large majority of the Fortune 500 companies as well. Some other factors, but my favorite is our NPS score at the very bottom. That's our Net Promoter Score at the bottom right. And it's a 73, which is double the leading industry average. And this is not even on a scale of 1 to 100. It actually starts from a negative number. So to be a plus 73 is really good. It just shows kind of what Veeam is doing and our reputation. We see here the Veeam availability platform. As Veeam has evolved over the years, we've begun to come out with new products where we just started with VMware when we first came about. We expanded to Hyper-V. Now we do physical, we do Office 365, right? And so as we come out with more and more products to handle these data solutions, we don't want to have just a whole bunch of different products that don't go together. We want to have an availability platform that gives you everything. So if you look from left to right, on the arc here, we see private cloud, VMware Hyper-V, managed or hybrid clouds where you have maybe a mix, some public cloud offerings, IoT, the Internet of Things, SaaS offerings like Office 365, and then your physical Windows, Linux, even Oracle and AIX systems, and then orchestrating all of those different workloads. Then we look into the middle where we see visibility and monitoring of all these platforms, whether it's products like Veeam One or the Veeam Availability Console for single pane of glass, both for physical, on-prem, off-site, in the cloud. Our data labs, which I'll talk about in the slides here in a moment, just being able to crack open that data, do testing with the backups themselves before you restore, and also universal APIs. Earlier, Joe mentioned some different SAN devices that Veeam works very well with, and being able to integrate directly into their storage APIs and bring some really cool technology there. I am a cloud engineer, and one thing that we hear a lot in the industry is how ambiguous the word cloud is. So we see here that 81% of enterprises have a multi-cloud strategy. So that could be anything from infrastructure as a service to backup as a service, disaster recovery as a service, which both two, by the way, are what we're going to talk about here in a moment. But it's just a very interesting stat that when cloud first came out, people weren't too sure about it. Now cloud is pretty much at the forefront of every conversation when it comes to businesses and their data. So let's talk about backup as a service versus disaster recovery as a service. What are the differences, and when do you think you'll need them? So this kind of simple, kind of crude example or analogy that I like to use, but I think it really drives home the point of the difference. Imagine you have a two-car garage, and you could either have your primary car, and then you could have all of the pieces stacked away in boxes that you need to rebuild that car. The good thing about that is you're going to have a lot of extra space in your garage. It's not going to take up that secondary car space, but it's going to take a long time to rebuild that vehicle. Whereas with, and that's going to be, you know, backups, right, or even copies of backups. Whereas disaster recovery, Veeam uses replication. So for our replication, just imagine having an exact copy of that car. Your first car were to go out, you can just jump into the next car, turn the keys on, and be on your way. So that's kind of really the differences between having a copy of a backup, low overhead, takes longer to restore, better for archival, versus replication, where you just have, you know, your tier 1 applications, or maybe even your whole data center replicated, ready to turn on at a moment's notice. So let's take a look more at backup as a service first, and then we'll go into DR. So backup as a service brings me to probably the most critical aspect of backup, and that's the 3-2-1 rule. That means having 3 copies of your data on 2 different devices, with one of those offsite. And the thinking there is if you follow the 3-2-1 rule, it should lead to 0 errors. So you've got your production data. You've got a copy of that locally. You have another copy of that on a secondary media, hopefully at one of offsite secure data centers, and should lead you to 0 errors there. When we think about copying backups, especially across the wire to maybe offsite via our Cloud Connect functionality, which is the way that we get backups across the internet without needing a VPN. It's based on TLS, the upgraded version of SSL technology. Backups are securely sent across the internet over a single port. Sometimes we think about our WAN speeds and what kind of uplinks and downlinks we have. So you see in the middle picture here, we do offer WAN acceleration as well. So if you have bandwidth, you know, anywhere from 10 to even 100 megs, we can do some caching mechanisms in place that would allow backups to get there faster. And if you just look from left to right, you've got your production environment, you've got your first copy of your backup, so that's 2 of the 3-2-1. And then you've got your secondary copy off-site. So now you've got your 3 copies. You've got on 2 different devices, one repository and the other one, and that second one is off-site. So whether the repository went down, or you got hit with ransomware, or if, you know, for some reason your whole building was down for whatever reason, natural disaster, a power outage, human error, you still got that secondary copy. And whether you've got the replication, which we see on the top right, or you've got the backup copy, you're able to do those restores and get your data back. The benefits of backup as a service, so some of the really cool things you can do using backups is, our first is our object storage integration. So this is something new that Veeam has had out for, I think, 3 or 4 months now, give or take, and it allows you to take a backup that you've put on disk. Perhaps you send those backups to offsite, you have copies of those locally and offsite, and then offsite can allow you to archive your backups to object storage, so maybe you can get a better deal on keeping backups for a very long time. You know, you need backups for months and years, more of that GFS style retention. Another cool feature with backups is instant VM recovery. So while replication is going to be your true DR business continuity solution, sometimes, you know, that's a lot more expensive. There's more overhead involved. Some machines may be very important, but maybe not so important that you have to have mirrored copies. Maybe you just have 1 or 2 machines that need to be powered on very quickly. What we're able to do here in this scenario, your VM goes down, we're able to go directly into the backup repository and mount the backup file to your production host as an NFS mount, and literally have your virtual machine back up and running in minutes. So you can think about it like a spare tire. You're going to be able to get back on the road quickly, but at some point you are going to have to put on the new tire. So what we'll do is we'll take whatever changes happened while that was running off of its backup and merge them to complete the VM transfer. We also have our Veeam Explorers. These are some of my favorite things in Veeam itself. So, of course, we can do file level recoveries, but we take it way beyond that. Say putting an email back into Exchange, being able to restore users and computers into Active Directory. You know, maybe some changes were made, some permissions were altered. We've seen all kinds of cases, from malicious employees trying to mess up directory services to people making honest mistakes, which could really mess up your whole environment if you don't have the right permissions and groupings inside of Active Directory. And then also SQL databases. So being very granular with the functionality of how we restore those different applications. Oh, sorry about that. A few more animations than I thought there was there. So Data Labs, I mentioned that I talk about this a little bit. So what this does is, for one, it gives you the ability to verify that your backups are going to be good. We'll actually mount the backup to the host, and we'll do this inside an isolated environment. We'll separate it from the rest of your production network and do some various tests like VMware tools, heartbeat tests, ping tests, etc. But now with these Data Labs, what we can also do is called a secure restore. So let's say that your production environment gets hit with a zero-day virus. So it doesn't execute right away. Maybe this virus doesn't release itself for like 30 days. You panic, you go to do a restore from a backup, but what if some of that backup is also infected? So before you go to do the restore, what we can do is we can take the backup files and mount them to the server. We can do an antivirus scan of the backup itself. If no issues are found, we can restore, go about our day. If there is something wrong, we can either restore without network access so that we can open the VM. Maybe if you have some guys smart enough, they can remove that bug, or they can put it into a quarantine zone and do some forensics analysis on it. Or we also have the ability to abort the operation completely and find another restore point, or maybe go to that secondary copy over in the cloud. Really cool stuff. And this is just kind of showing, as a diagram of what I was mentioning. The backup sits stagnant. We don't see it for some time. Maybe that's why your antivirus software didn't pick it up, is because it hadn't been launched and we weren't able to recognize it. Once we are able to recognize it, we have that ability to isolate those and have a couple options of restore. So Sure Backup, I kind of spilled the beans already on this one, but this is what I mentioned, where we're taking the backup files, we're mounting them to the host. So this is very similar to Instant VM Recovery that I mentioned earlier. The main difference here is this is isolated. So this virtual lab that you see in the middle is a Linux VM that is deployed on your host, and Veeam does all of this for you. All you have to do is point to the host. We deploy all these virtual labs and all this, so it's not very complicated at all. We're going to take the backups, we're going to spin them up inside this virtual lab. It's very fast because we're doing this in a read-only fashion. And again, we're going to do an application test, a ping test, and a VMware Tools Heartbeat tech, or for those who have Hyper-V, we'll do a Hyper-V integration test. Send you an email to let you know everything was good, or if it wasn't, at least you'll know. You can even keep those backups running in this virtual lab so that you can do some sandboxing. You can go into those machines, apply Windows patches, updates. Everything will be blown up when you're finished with it, and you can kind of test those things out before you introduce them into production. Okay, so real quickly, we're going to finish this up with talking about disaster recovery as a service. Again, this is having that spare car in the driveway so that you can just hop right in. So here we see an entire data center, or maybe even a whole city that has been decimated by some sort of natural disaster. And what are you going to do in that scenario? It doesn't matter if you had backups, right? It doesn't matter if you had high availability in your data center, because your data center is gone. You're losing money every second, every minute. So that's the benefit of disaster recovery as a service. Right? You get push button disaster recovery. You log in from a laptop, maybe even a client, a tablet or cell phone. You're able to literally push a button, and all of your virtual machines power on in OffSite's data center. That's all done by something called a failover plan. So failover plans are preemptively done at the customer side on their Veeam server. They're going to execute which VMs get deployed first, in what order. If there's any boot delays, maybe it takes 2 minutes for your AD server to come on before you can get to Exchange and SQL. So what we see here is we've replicated all our VMs. We have our failover plan in place. The production machine, the whole data center probably is out. We log on. We execute our failover plan with any of those boot delays that I mentioned. And within a few minutes, your whole data center is now up and running at OffSite's secure location. You're able to continue working with those same machines, whether you have machines that need internet access or just some file servers that need private IPs. All that can be done preemptively, so that all you have to do is get back to doing whatever you do that makes you money. And I think we'll stop it there with the Veeam slogan, "It just works." And then with that, Joe, I'll pass it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Brandon. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, good. With that said, I'm going to throw up a quick Q&A panel. If anyone would like to punch in a question there with the tools, you can put in an anonymous question if you'd like, and then we'll address it if we can. I see one coming in via chat. Brandon, the question via chat was, can backup as a service be used to restore a VM to the cloud?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from a Veeam perspective, it definitely can. The difference in BAS and DRAS is with DRAS, you push the button and the machines are automatically spun up. If you're using backup as a service and those backups are in a service provider's data center and you wanted to restore them into their data center, that is possible. You would just have to ask that service provider if they would do that. I'm sure OFFSITE would do that. It's just a manual process on their part. But if you need to restore VM into the cloud from a backup, yes, it can absolutely be done with Veeam.
Yep. And we can do that with our Veeam Cloud Connect service.
Sure.
If anyone else has questions real quick, we'll take any additional questions we can in the next few minutes. Otherwise, I want to make sure before people leave, we get one last quick big thank you out. I appreciate everyone's time and the efforts made to set it aside and get here and join us. If you have any other questions or other items we didn't follow up on, looks like we've got another. The next question was, can backup as, oh, we got a thank you. Sorry, we got a thank you on the first question. I thought it was another.
You're welcome. That's my answer.
I really thank you for that. If any other items you'd like to cover on these topics, feel free to contact us. Feel free to reach out to us at sales@off-site.com. That's sales@off-site.com. And we'll be quick to get back to you, and also we'll follow up with a little thank you to you later today. Looks like we have no more questions, Brandon, so I'm going to end this presentation. I appreciate everyone's time. You all have a great afternoon.
Yep. Thanks, guys.